Russell, thank you for joining me. My name's Matt. I'm the ARTP Vice Chair. Um, it's great to have you on board. First of all, could you just tell us a bit about yourself? What's your background?
It's nice to be with you, Matt. I've been looking forward to this chat. I guess my background is I'm a COPD patient. I was diagnosed in 2011 with a FEV1 of around 22%, so quite a low lung function. Um, I guess when I was first diagnosed, I didn't know a lot about COPD. In fact, I'd never heard of it when the doctor coined that phrase. So, like a lot of patients, I think I went home and asked Dr. Google to tell me all about COPD, which I don't recommend so much. It's all about your search criteria. Um, and I guess where it led me was that I had medications I had to take, but there was no real pathway for me to improve my quality of life, which at that stage was pretty poor. I remember I used to struggle to go to work for a couple of hours a day, and then I'd come home and sleep for most of the day. And I guess in the early days, I fell into a bit of depression because there just didn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel, I guess. I was only 45 years old. I still had kids at high school. So I had all these goals that I wanted to see my kids grow up. I wanted to see them get married and have grandkids, pretty much like any other person would. But I didn't know how I was going to get there. I guess for me and my wife, it was a matter of sitting down and working out what we could do, but not the type of people who just, sit on our hands and do nothing. So what we did know is that exercise is a good thing to do, and it's potential to make you fitter and healthier. No one can deny that. So it was then about how I could get back into some sort of exercise. And I guess gradually, that's my story over the years. Is I've built myself up, or built my exercise capacity up to being able to complete Ironman and marathons events.
Wow, so that's quite amazing. What was your previous exercise experience like? Did this all come about because of the COPD?
Um, so I've got a history of poor health. I guess that would be the best way to sum it up. Sort of in my late 20s and early 30s, I had a pretty ordinary lifestyle. I did everything wrong. I smoked, I drank too much, I ate a very poor diet. And that caught up with me eventually. I had a stroke when I was 36 years old. And that was a real eye opener to me that I had to sort of try and get my health back, so to speak. I have been active in my younger life. I played a lot of football and other sports. So to me, I'd gone so badly down the wrong track as far as health concerned. It was going to be a long way back. And I guess, back then I was about 25 kilos heavier than I am now. So it's been quite a sort of transformation for me. So getting into exercise was really important after I had my stroke. Um, but it was difficult because I'd been a lifelong asthmatic. So breathlessness has always been a big part of my life. So, when you marry that up with poor health, overweight, smoking, and then trying to exercise, it wasn't a fun combination.
Yeah.
But, in relation to my COPD diagnosis, then definitely I knew the benefits of exercise. It's just, I guess for a lot of people, it's you've got to find your why, what's going to make you get out to the door and do that exercise.
Yeah. So what exercise were you actually doing at the time?
So after I had my stroke, I sort of got talked into taking up cycling from my son, who was a mad cyclist. So did a bit of cycling, enjoyed that, and gradually got fitter and lost some weight. I wasn't very quick because I was quite a chronic asthmatic, but I enjoyed it. At the time, I had a friend of mine who was doing triathlons, and I used to watch him do triathlons. I used to say to him, "Haven't you got anything better to do with your time?" Which I think back now is quite funny. um, he eventually talked me into doing a triathlon, and that's really um, become my what's the word I'm looking for? Obsession. I participated in a lot of triathlons before being diagnosed with COPD. Again, I was very slow. In fact, one race I did, they didn't do the presentations until the last person crossed the finishing line, which was me. I got the biggest round of applause for the day because I'd finished and they could get on with everything else. So, you know, but to me, I just love doing it. So, that triathlons were my big thing.
Okay. So what would you say is your driving force? Like, how do you push yourself, even though like during these events, it must be quite difficult?
I guess back then to versus now, back then all I thought I was an asthmatic. But given my history and my poor diagnosis when I had COPD, it would be safe to say that I'd had COPD for quite a while and just not realised that's what it was. So back before my diagnosis, it was really just a form of fun and keeping myself fit. It was hard, but that's what I enjoyed doing. Whereas now, my driving force to exercise is quality of life. Trying to maintain my lung function, not letting it slide, so I can sort of achieve all those things I want to achieve. Watch my kids get married, which they have, acquire some grandchildren, which I have. So, it's worked out pretty well for me.
That's really good. How do you utilize lung function exercise testing, like to inform what you do?
I have a saying that I borrowed for someone else. I can't remember who. And it is, if you can't measure it, you can't better it. So to me, I test my spirometry quite regularly for two reasons. One, to make sure it's not declining, and two, to see if I can improve it. And, being diagnosed at 22% predicted FEV1 to now I'm 35% of predicted FEV1, I have been able to improve my lung function. Spirometry is an important part of that. I don't measure it as much as I used to because I feel like I've reached a point where I haven't seen any more improvement for probably about 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen any decline as well.
And would you say the spirometry changes from the 22 to 35%, was that down to therapies as well, or was it all down to exercise? What would you say was the difference?
I think it was a combination of having a really good nutritional strategy. I had a case study published in 2021 about the nutritional strategy I used to manage my disease. So that, along with just being consistent with my exercise, and I really am a big advocate of that to other patients, is consistency is the key. We see so often where patients will go into pulmonary rehab, they'll go through the program, and then 12 months later, they're back there again because they haven't maintained that consistency. And, for me, that's, the number one thing I've got to do is make sure I'm out there being active. Activity for me is part of my lifestyle now. It's not just a hobby that I do, it's part of who I am.
Yeah. And also, like we've previously spoken, you've said that you also use exercise testing as well. So I believe you've done full cardiopulmonary exercise tests as well.
I have. So I've done lots of them. They're another thing that I'm quite pedantic about because, again, it's a way of measuring how I'm going. My output these days isn't as good as it was 10 years ago. But it's still, I still sit in the 110, 115% predicted. So, I'm still better than what I'm supposed to be,
Yeah.
which is, always my target with that sort of testing is to make sure I don't fall under that 100%. For me, that's important. And to be able to do that allows me to maintain a good quality of life.
And conversely, what's the clinician's response when they see your spirometry compared to what they see from your exercise testing results?
Very entertaining for me when I see that. Where I get my spirometry testing done these days, or my CPAP testing, is a hospital setting here in Brisbane where I live. And they know me very well. So quite often what they'll do these days is they'll get in students to watch me go through spirometry and then through the exercise testing. And they'll ask the students, what do they think the outcome's going to be with the exercise testing? And I haven't seen one get it right yet. So, and to me, yeah, I'm really proud that I can sort of push those limits. But it's more about showing other people that if you adopt the right strategies, you can live a good quality of life with this disease.
Yeah.
But yeah, the look on their faces when they see me doing what I do in a testing environment is priceless.
Do you play on that when you walk in? So you come in extra wheezy and go from that sort of angle, and then, ow, look at this exercise.
No, but I could do. I haven't, but it's to me, it's really important for students to see that sort of thing because I think too many times a patient is judged by their numbers. And I've seen that in patient populations that I talk to, their spirometry might be pretty bad, but they're still out there pushing their limits and doing things that is not expected of them. So I think, being able to change that perception of patients that, hey, his spirometry is no good, he's not going to be able to do much, to, okay, his spirometry is not that great. What can he do? Because I always say, you can measure lung function, but you can't measure will. And, the will of a patient is very important.
Yeah, I remember we had a few years ago a patient come through. Um, he was an older gentleman. We asked the usual sort of questions to try and determine what sort of exercise it was. He was saying how he was breathless, and we based it on that. And then we did the exercise test, and he went on for like, I think it was around about 15 minutes. And then afterwards, he gets off, and then he said, "Oh, yeah, well, uh, he'd only sort of told us that he was like doing normal levels of activity. And then after the exercise, he told us that he does go mountain biking at the weekends. And that was the reason why he was able to do 15 minutes.
Yeah, yeah.
So, uh, what equipment do you use to support your exercise?
I use a range of things. I'm my own personal guinea pig, so I like to experiment with all sorts of different things. I guess the things that are my mainstays is heart rate straps. So I've got a particular heart rate strap that allows me to personalize my training zones, and I've only been using that for about a year now, and I find it very useful. When I'm training for marathons, I can really hone in on what my heart rate zones are for particular training sessions. So that's really important. Also measuring my oxygen levels. So I run with an oxygen backpack on these days. So it's important for me to titrate those oxygen levels in for when I'm being active. So using pulse oximetry, I use a number of different types of pulse oximeters. And you have to measure that quite accurately when you're training to make sure you have the right levels because it's quite difficult to sort of be adjusting levels when you're in a race situation, even though I have been able to do that. The other things, that I've experimented and find really interesting is blood flow restriction cuffs, and I use them for certain treadmill running sessions. There's starting to be more and more research into blood flow restriction, not only for the general athletic population, but also for COPD patients. So, they're the sort of things I like to use. But I also do things because I'm a bit wacky. I'm very conscious of maintaining stable blood glucose levels. So I measure blood glucose levels generally every few days, but certainly when I'm doing training sessions. For me personally, I know that when my blood glucose is high, I am more breathless and my training sessions aren't as good. And I'm saying that just to clarify, I'm not a diabetic or anything like that. I do it purely for my own investigations.
Yeah. And do you have like set zones that you try and aim for with like heart rate saturations?
Yeah, definitely. I always say to people, like, for COPD patients, my training is not much different to a normal person. It's just it's more restricted as far as what I can do. So, and I always say to people, my marathon preparation is always going to be longer than anyone else's because typically for a marathon you would go out and do at least one 30-kilometer run during your preparation. Closer to the end of your training program. And so my 30K will probably be about an hour or so longer than the average Joe. So when you add up all the hours over, say, a 6-month preparation for a marathon, the amount of hours I'm out there doing things is quite extensive. But I still do the same things as a normal person do. I'll have a long run, I'll have a recovery run, I'll do a hill session. I'm really big on interval sessions, really making myself as breathless as possible, because when you transfer that into a race state, it's very useful. Also doing things like doing hot run sessions. So if I'm probably halfway through a marathon preparation, I'll wait till we get a warm day and go out and run in the middle of the day. Because I find that exertion and that breathlessness in the heat really, what would I say, transforms into running in a cold climate. So in Australia here, when I'm doing my marathon preparations to run in an overseas marathon, generally we're running through our summer and we run the marathon over in the northern hemisphere, so it'll be winter. And so doing hot sessions like that are really helpful. So, there's a lot of things that you can play around with. I guess over the years I couldn't even tell you how many marathons I've done now. It's in the 20s. So I've got a fair idea of what works for me as far as training sessions. And also it comes down to, what my goals are for a specific race. So, an example would be last September I ran the Berlin Marathon. And so the cutoff time for that is shorter than others. So my training, my lead up or my training program for that race was about 10 months long. Whereas I've got a race coming up here in Australia in about 3 months' time. And my preparation for that race will be a lot shorter because the cutoffs are a lot more generous. So, I don't think I'm any different in some aspects to anyone else running and preparing for an event. It's just you have those little things that you've got to take into account. Obviously, having a respiratory issue.
And I'm sure that with everything that you wear during your training and also the events, you must get a lot of data. Are you able to talk through any of the data that you sort of collect and review?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you asked me that because currently there's a couple of researchers who are actually doing a case study based on all my data that I've collected through my devices over the last, 14 years. And it's a really interesting pattern when you sort of look at my data, and I've gone through a little bit in this with my case study, and changing my nutritional approach. The races I did after that, my times were actually quicker, but the amount of training I did those events wasn't as much. So my exercise hours actually dropped off, but the way I prepared for a race was a lot more detailed, and that detail was definitely improved results. And you can clearly see that with my exercise data.
Yeah.
Because as you imagine, your training hours for an Ironman event is going to be significantly higher than that for just doing a marathon. So yeah, there's definitely a pattern there that's quite interesting. So I'm interested to see what the case study looks like.
Yeah. Like if I was to exercise, I know that I get a very sort of different heart rate response. My heart rate goes up quite quickly, and I'm not anything near an athlete. The other thing that happens is my saturations drop quite a lot, which I'm guessing you must have as well, because that's why you run with the oxygen.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So when I first started into exercise, generally speaking, about 140 beats per minute would see my exercise, see my saturation sort of drop off a cliff, so to speak. And you can see that in my exercise testing. But what I've found and what my testing shows is the fitter I become, my saturations, stay constant for a bit longer. But what happens generally in marathon, once those saturations drop, they don't recover. They're down for good. So that's why I need to have the oxygen
Yeah.
to keep those saturations up. And it's a new sort of thing for me, because when I first started running marathons, I didn't need oxygen. And then it was about 6-7 years ago, had a bad infection. And so from then on, I had to use oxygen. And I had no idea, what I was doing. So I just thought I'd get a backpack and throw an oxygen concentrator in there and see what happened. And it works really well.
Good.
And nowadays, fortunately, there's companies out there who are making concentrators and backpacks that are very fit for purpose, as far as if you want to go hiking or anything like that. So
Yeah.
it's good.
Because they're quite heavy, aren't they? So that you obviously had the additional weight to carry on, but you had also then the support from the oxygen. So it must have been quite a fine balance to work out how to get there. So it's
It,
good for
it, it is a balance, because you have the oxygen to maintain your saturations, but you're also putting more load on your lungs, because, the machine in the backpack, you've got about 4 kilos there. So carrying an extra 4 kilos over 42 kilometers is quite demanding. But you sort of it's trial and error. You know where you need to be as far as your oxygen settings. And for me, like if I'm doing a marathon, it's about a pattern of running. So, I will generally run for say 900 meters, then I'll walk for 100 meters. And that 100 meters I'm walking is to work on my breathing, because I'm generally hyperinflated by then, and also just to get everything back in, as I say, my running zen, so I can then start running again. So, and there are things you can't do straight away.
yeah.
That takes a lot of training to get to that point.
And do you find that when you're doing your marathons that you do a combination of running and walking all the way through, or are you able to run continuously?
Normally it's running and walking. What was interesting in Berlin, because I had quite a long training process, and I incorporated a whole lot of things that I haven't put into one training program before. So I was doing the hot running, I was doing blood flow restriction, doing all these things. And so for the first time, I was actually able to run the first half of the race non-stop. So that was really, I was quite chuffed with that, because that's something I've not been able to do before. When I'm running marathons, I know what my marathon looks like. So for the first 30 Ks, obviously I'm very breathless, but I can maintain and keep myself composed. generally after 30 Ks, the wheels fall off, and they do in every marathon. And so then it's about a matter of managing how I am, not doing anything silly. And if that means I've got to walk for a kilometre, then that's what I've got to do. So I always look at, when I'm thinking about a time I have to make for a marathon, it's how quickly I can get to 30 Ks, because I know after that I'm not going to be doing anything spectacular. So,
Yeah.
there's sort of things that you've got to think of with COPD, whereas if you're a runner, they talk about negative splits where you're running the second half of the race quicker than the first half. Well, that's impossible for me.
And I guess you must have to put a whole load of planning into how you're going to run each race and each event type thing, because you probably need to manage it for your condition as much as for the actual event itself.
The hard part is for me, or the tricky part, should I say, is that when you're getting to an end of a marathon training prep, you're really been doing a lot of work. So your immune system's compromised. You're very likely to get an infection or go downhill. So for me, it's really important towards the last 8 weeks of my preparation is to really keep an eye on my health and listen to my body. If I'm feeling a bit off, then I'll take a day off training. I have no problem doing that. Whereas in the earlier days, I might have pushed myself and then have to miss 2 weeks of training because I got sick or something like that. So, and you learn these things along the way, obviously. For me, it's doing as much work as I can, but also, thinking about how am I feeling, is my breathing changed? And I've got devices where I measure respiratory rate overnight and body temperature and all these different things to give me an idea of where I am. And, touch wood, I haven't had to pull out of a marathon because I've had an infection. So I must be doing something right so far.
Yeah. And I guess that's the thing with the long-term condition, isn't it? You get to know your body so well, it tells you what you'll need to do. Do you ever find that sometimes the devices disagree with what your body's telling you?
Um, Occasionally, but I think it's like I've had times where I use a device to measure body temperature, and generally, well, it's quite accurate as far as predicting me being unwell. So if I see a rise in my body temperature, I know something's happening. There's been times where I go, that's not right, I feel great. And I'll go out and do something. And then at the end of it, I'll think, yeah, I shouldn't have done that, So, and I think that's more of, me ignoring what the obvious is. And, you fall into that trap sometimes because you might be behind in your training or you're feeling better than what, the measurements are saying, but the measurements are a little bit ahead of what you're feeling. So,
Can I ask, you've mentioned a couple of times the blood flow restriction. What is that? How does that work?
So they're basically cuffs that you wrap around your thighs or your upper thighs, and they inflate to restrict the blood flow restriction to the muscles. So the studies show that actually improves muscle endurance. But also there's research that shows that it actually improves VO2 max as well. So it's been quite commonly used in Tour de France cyclists for part of their training. I got put onto it purely for recovery. So some physios do use it for recovering from knee surgery and things like that. So I used it to recover from knee surgery, and I just found the recovery was so quick using these cuffs. So I started to do a little bit more investigation about it. And I've been using them now for about 3 years. So where they're very useful for running is that I can inflate them to a certain pressure where I hop on the treadmill and it mimics the fatigue in my legs at around the 35-kilometre mark of a marathon. So, it's in a way I'm getting that effect without having to do those long endurance runs. And I've done a few marathons where I've changed my training and utilized just blood flow restrictions for my longer runs to mimic my longer runs. And what was interesting is there wasn't a lot of time difference between using blood flow restriction versus not. So there are studies I know that are going on in the UK around using blood flow restriction for COPD patient. So for resistance training. So how that would work is if you put cuffs on the arms and a patient is doing weights, with the restriction, a 2 kilo dumbbell doing a bicep curl with that, with the cuffs on, would be like doing a 10-kilo dumbbell, but without the load. So they're not lifting a heavy weight, but their muscle is getting that fatigue of lifting a heavier weight. So for a COPD patient, you can do larger loads of exercise without demanding more from your lungs. So you're not getting as breathless, but you're still using those larger loads.
With that, have you ever used like any of the muscle oxygenation measuring devices, such as like the near infrared spectroscopy?
No, that's a bit out of my home lab realm. I mean, there's in Australia, like we're quite restricted on what we can and can't do. Like your exercise testing, it's frowned upon to do it any more than once a year because it's claimable through the health system.
Right.
I'm fortunate to have a doctor and people I do that testing with that if I say, hey, I want to do some testing to compare it with something, then they'll allow me to do it. So, in an ideal world in my house, I'd have all these things, all these gadgets set up here, so I could do my VO2 max testing regularly, within the house and all that sort of thing. Because for me, all those things are really important. The relationship between VO2 max and longevity and health is well known. And certainly for a COPD patient, I know the higher my VO2 max is, the better I'm feeling and the better or the easier my daily activities are.
So with all this information, how do you utilize that to improve your health?
I guess, when you look at, say, your training zones for running a marathon, so, you're going to do specific training zones to improve your VO2 max, for instance. So that interval training and then, the type of interval training. So VO2 max training, people commonly think that's, pushing yourself to the very limit, like Tabata, that sort of training, where what I've found it's more about gradually building up to getting not to your max, but 80 or 90% of that. So I've done a few different things, and what works for me is if I'm doing an interval session where it's say 400 meters on, 400 meters off, that 400 meters on will be starting slow 100 meters and then increasing the speed every 100 meters until the last 100 meters I'm at around 80 to 90% of my max. And so I'd love to have an apparatus that I can measure at home, measure my VO2 max at home and get more accurate data, because what I use now is just a guide, but it's useful. So I find, the different gadgets I use are really helpful as far as knowing where I am at, not only in my training, but in day-to-day life. And that goes to, spirometry, your heart rate straps, your blood glucose levels, all these things for me, sort of all form together to give you a picture on how you're traveling. And all this stuff has been researched in COPD, and the blood glucose levels, I found a researcher in the UK who'd done some research on the relevance of high blood glucose level which can be longer stays in hospital for COPD patients and longer exacerbations. So for me to keep those blood glucose levels low is putting my body in a better space.
Yeah. We probably already sort of touched on this, but how do you actually approach training with a lung condition?
These days, really confidently. And I feel like, and it's funny because I feel like, and my doctor said to me probably a year or so ago, he said to me, imagine what you could do with a good set of lungs. And I said, well, yeah, but would I have the same will to do those
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
because I'd have a good set of lungs? So, I mean, nowadays, like I've done so many marathons now, I know what I have to do. I know what my preparation looks like. I know where my target points are along the way, where I have to get to. But that's taking many years of experimenting, getting things right, getting things wrong along the way. And, I have patients reach out to me and say, hey, I want to have a go at running a marathon. And I go, well, that's wonderful, but it's not something you can do quickly. You have to, build up and to get to this point. And I think people sometimes look at me and go, COPD patient running marathons, that doesn't make sense. But I didn't get there straight away. It's taken a lot of trial and error to get to this point.
And I think also, like with you particularly, Russell, is you came from a point of good exercise first and worked downward. So you didn't drop from doing the Ironmans down to marathons, where I think most probably other COPD patients are going from doing nothing at all, trying to build up. So I think it's setting like reasonable goals for it, isn't it?
It is, and it's something that I really try to emphasize to people when I'm sharing my story. It's not about running marathons. Everyone will have their own personal marathon, and that could be just walking out to the letterbox to check the mail. My reality when I first got diagnosed, when I started back into exercise, it was walking around the block. It was just doing those things. But I think where I've found the big improvements come is the consistency. So not walking around the block once a week, but doing it every day. But listening to your body, whether it's good to do that in the morning or in the night time. And as a patient, you have to take into account the outside environment. Is there a lot of wind around? Is there smoke in the air? All these sorts of things. So, it's there's a lot to consider, and it's a hard journey, but as I say to people, it's a worthwhile one. So you've just got to stick with it.
And I think this sort of very much goes in line with the things that people try to do with pulmonary rehab.
Absolutely. It's I think the biggest thing people have got to get out of their pulmonary rehab is that this isn't something I do for 6 or 8 weeks. This is now my new life. So when I go out of pulmonary rehab, I then continue on doing it myself. And, it's important to have a network around you to encourage you to do that. My wife will constantly be at me if I'm, feeling a bit down, or I say, oh, I couldn't be bothered going out for a run. She'll go, well, yes, you will. So having that support around you, I think, is very important. And so, pulmonary rehab, without a doubt, is the best thing someone can do, especially if they come from a non-exercise background. So, get into that rehab, learn how to exercise, learn how to look after you, learn how to take your inhalers properly, all those different things. And then once you learn that, apply them to your everyday life.
So we talked a bit about training, but can you talk a bit about your actual experiences of doing the marathons and what's happened to you during these events and how have you found them?
Oh, I could write a book on it, honestly. It's and I might one day. Look at the experiences you have. I guess anyone who's run a marathon will know the term about facing your demons, because they always hit us in a marathon, and it's generally, that 30 to 40K mark is where they really hit. And I remember, a story many years ago, when I was doing the Boston Marathon, and the year I did that race was the worst weather conditions I'd ever had. It just poured down raining the whole day. It was cold. It was miserable. And if it wasn't the fact I'd travelled all the way to Boston to do the race, I wouldn't have done the race. So for me, it was all about just getting through the race healthy and not getting sick afterwards. Anyhow, so around the 30K point of the race, I was cold, wet, miserable, hating life. And this woman was waving at me. She was a spectator out front of a house, and she was cooking something. So I went over there, and she said to me, "Would you like a cup of chicken soup, love?" And it was the best thing in the world. I was cold, miserable, and she gave me a cup of chicken soup, and it was just sort of that got me home for the rest of the race. So you have things like that. In Berlin in September last year, I had pretty bad experience around the 35K mark where my hyperinflation got to such a point I just had to stop and sit down. It was quite significant. It's probably the worst I'd been in a race, because of the time commitments I had for that race. I had to really push myself, and I paid the price around the 35K mark. I had a film crew following me for that race. They released a little doco about my journey, and when I've replayed it and I've looked at myself, I think, oh dear, I wasn't in a good place. So, but that's part of the experience. I mean, I say all this, but I always say I will do things safely. So, my support runner in that race, I sort of made him aware of what things might look like later on in the race. So he was good as telling me, all right, you need to stop, you need to sit down, you need to recover, and that sort of thing. So, you have a lot of different experiences, some good, some bad, but you learn from them all.
And do you think there was anything particular that brought on the dynamic hyperinflation? Obviously, you're going to get it, but was there things that led to it being worse in that situation?
Yeah, so every race I do, I study the course profile, because, hills and all those sorts of things affect me. But what I know is I'd rather have a short, sharp uphill with a downhill recovery. That's fine. But when I have these long, gradual gradients, they just cut me in half. And that's what
Yeah.
Berlin was. I think from the 25 to the 30K mark, it was just a slight uphill gradient the whole way. And that's just, I can't deal with that. So yeah, that was definitely the catalyst for me, getting to where I got to.
Yeah. You and me both.
Yeah, I think it's every patient's worst nightmare is hills.
I know that and
Yeah.
stairs, but oh well.
Yeah.
And I think carrying loads as well, that's always a big thing. So you start carrying loads into that as well. It almost doubles the sort of rate of the hill. Um, do you still get the same sort of excitement crossing the line?
I do. And I sort of always said that Berlin would be my last race because it was the last race of the World Marathon Majors. So I sort of tick that box and, move on and do something else. But I love running. And that's the thing. For me, it's really, and I know this sounds really strange, but it's very meditative for me. So when I'm out running and I get myself into pattern, all I'm doing is concentrating on my breathing, but that takes me away from everything else in my life. It's very meditative. My wife notices when I'm not running that I get a bit, antsy and a bit frustrating. So, I think running will be a part of my life until I can't.
Yeah.
So, I'm still entering marathons, and I still enjoy the preparation. I can't say it's getting any easier, but it's easier as far as I know what to do. But I'm getting older. I'm 59 this year, and next year I've got a big marathon to do in Sydney here in Australia, and I'll be over 60 by then. So time catches up to everyone. So
Yeah.
we'll just keep running for as long as I can.
And do you think, I'm guessing probably what you'll start to do is probably scale back the size of the events that you do. So maybe keep on running, but not necessarily marathons, or is that the plan?
You would think so. But it's like my brothers are right into park run, doing a 5K run, and I say to them, I don't see the point. If you're going to run 5K, why don't you run 40K? I like the challenge of endurance events. Um, I've done a couple of ocean swims, and I think that's potentially where I'll go after running, because you can control your breathing a lot better when you're swimming. Um, I haven't really figured out how I can have oxygen when I'm swimming yet. I have some ideas, but I haven't
Yeah.
haven't sort of mastered that plan yet. So,
Oh,
and to me, that's what it's all about. I mean, you've got to not say, I can't do this anymore. You've got to find a different way of doing things. So it was like when I went from running without oxygen to running with oxygen. So that was just a new challenge to carry an oxygen machine on my back while I'm running. So for me, I'm sure my knees one day I'll say it's time to stop running. So I think swimming and cycling will probably
yeah.
be my thing. So, you know, but the key is, you've just got to keep doing stuff.
Yeah. Do you do backstroke or freestyle?
Freestyle. Yeah. And it's funny because when I first started swimming, after being diagnosed with COPD, I couldn't swim 10 meters, I just think, because I'd be just too breathless.
Yeah.
Then I discovered a device called a pull buoy, which was a game changer for me. It's a flotation device you put between your legs.
Yeah.
So it basically helps float from your hips down, so you don't have to kick, and all you have to worry about is
Your arms.
your stroke. And I've always trained with a pull buoy. Um, when I swim in salt water, it's a different story because salt gives you flotation anyhow,
Yeah.
buoyancy. So yeah, I think swimming will be where I end up next. I did tell my wife many years ago I wanted to swim the English Channel, and my wife and my doctor convinced me that it probably wasn't a smart thing to do. So I won't be doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I get almost panic attacks if I go into the water now. It's just the going face down where I used to swim, but now I tend not to. And I think it was like some bad. I went off the back of a boat to do some snorkeling, and because I went into the water to do the like treading water straight off the bat before I was already breathing way heavier because it's all limb movement. So then
Yeah,
trying to put face down and breathe through a big tube, couldn't do it.
nah.
But if I started off in the water, I could do it. But it was having that whole level of breathlessness to start with.
Yeah, it's a challenge, that's for sure.
Um, so, during the course of like your events that you do, have you had any like real standout moments other than the chicken soup?
That would stand out. Um, yeah, lots. I mean, I remember when I did my first overseas marathon. So that was the New York Marathon. And at a part of the race, I've been communicating in a Facebook group and for COPD patients. And one of the patients said, I live in New York. I'm going to come and watch you run. And I thought, well, there's a million people who watch the New York Marathon. So, I'll look out for you. So I was running through, I think it was through Queens, and you go around a corner. And on the corner, this woman was waving a sign that said, breathe easy. And I thought, surely not. So I ran over towards her, and it was her.
Oh,
So that was so
amazing.
cool. Because I take a lot of inspiration from patients and what they do. So that was a really good moment. Um, I guess probably if I was going to say the standout moment was when I finished my first Ironman, because everyone told me I wouldn't finish the race. I honestly didn't think I'd finish the race. I just wanted to start the race and see how far I could get through. And with Ironman, you have a 17-hour cutoff. Oh, I did the race in 16 hours and 52 minutes. And for me, crossing that finishing line sort of made me realize, okay, my spirometry says one thing, but what I can do says another. And on my website, I still have that catchphrase that come out of that night or that day was never let your disease define you. And I'm a true believer in that. As I said before, you can measure spirometry, but you can't measure will. And I think that's important.
Yeah. And if you had to sort of say, what would be your biggest challenges that you faced?
I think one of the things, like, obviously the exercise, running marathons, all that sort of thing is challenging, but it's that whole preparation and getting to a race. So, and that's one of the, like, when I finished Berlin, it was a relief in some respect, not knowing that I didn't have to do this anymore. I could just run marathons at home, because you've got to train for a marathon, but then when you're traveling, you've got to travel with oxygen. So you've got to get approvals from your airlines to be able to travel with oxygen. But also, I have to get medical clearance to run in these races. And the medical team in some of these races can be very pedantic about you meeting a criteria because they know you've got a lung condition. Okay, so we need a clearance from your doctor. We want to see your spirometry testing. We want to see your exercise testing and all those sorts of things. So I can enter a race and pay your entrance fee and book all the travel. But sometimes I won't get the clearance until the last minute. So like in Berlin, I didn't get official clearance to run until I think it was about a week before I left home to travel there. So that's really stressful, and it's challenging to sort of go through that process. And I have my own thoughts about providing so much detail to the event organisers because I think to myself, if my doctor is approving me to run in a race, aren't they the person best qualified to know whether I can? But it doesn't work like that, unfortunately.
And then were there any low points on the journey?
Not really. To be honest with you, I think I'm a pretty positive person. So, um, if you're thinking low points as far as my whole experience with COPD, probably the only point I would say would be around 2016, where a few healthcare professionals decided that I didn't have COPD. And they based that on the fact that I was able to run a marathon, and they determined that COPD patients can't run marathons. So I actually received quite an attack on social media, which was quite bad because it was a whole social media pile on because of one healthcare professional doubting I had COPD. Then a whole lot of other people jumped on. My parents got harassed. My family got harassed. It was definitely a low point as far as the whole journey. But after that I actually published my spirometry on my website for everyone to see. And it was probably the best thing I did because you don't have to be a medical professional to look at it and know that there's a fixed obstruction there.
Yeah, quite the doubters. Have you run in the UK?
I have. I did the London Marathon, and it was honestly one of the best races I've had. One, because I did a PB there, which was really exciting. But just the characters that you get in a London Marathon, it was one of the funniest races I've ever been in because of just the people who are in the race.
Yeah.
And I actually did the race. So there was another patient who did it as well. So it was really good. We met up on the start line and started the race together. So that was a really good experience. But yeah, it was definitely a memorable race. And I think myself, there's lots of races I'd like to go back and do again or do another one in a different country. But I think for the time being, I'm going to have a little rest from that. Um, my support runner from Berlin lives in the UK, so he's actually coming out to Australia next year to be my support runner in the Sydney Marathon. So it'll be a good reunion.
Obviously, you must have had all the characters, all the people in costumes as well. What do you think made the London Marathon your PB?
Well, it goes back to types of training, using all that data. So I was very honed into a nutritional strategy, um, specific types of training, and really honing in on interval stuff. And I just had a really good preparation, and I had done a lot of running in the heat in Australia because the race was in April in England, so it was still quite cool. I think race day was around 15 degrees. And I'd come out of training in Australia through the summer where I was running in 35-degree temperatures. And I think it was, that as well as the other things I've talked about just sort of aligned on a perfect day. And it was one of those days where, and I've said to my wife previously, when I was running, it was the first time I actually didn't feel like a COPD patient. It was just such a really nice day out. And I wasn't even trying to achieve a personal best. I just went out to run. And it wasn't until I got to the 30K mark and I actually still felt quite well. And I looked at my watch and I thought, hang on, I've got a chance here. And what was interesting is after the race, I met up with, I think at the time he was the chief financial officer of the British Lung Foundation, who is now ASTMA UK. And he looked at me and says, "You don't even look like you've run a marathon." And I said, "No." So I don't feel like it. And my recovery after that event was really good. I felt like I could have run another marathon 2 days later. So I think, you hear about people having their days where all the planets aligned. Well, that London Marathon was definitely that day for me.
And I think probably anybody listening to this would be interested. What is your PB?
5 hours 22. Yeah.
Well,
And what's interesting is that was pre having a carry and an oxygen backpack.
so you
So
did it
my
without
PB,
oxygen.
yes, yes. So nowadays, my PB with oxygen is 6 hours 8 minutes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it makes that much difference.
Oh yeah, yeah. So it was after that race actually. After London, we went on a holiday, did a river cruise in Europe, and the whole boat on the second week got sick, and I got quite a bad infection, the worst I've ever had actually. When I got back to Australia, I had about 4 months off work, um, but it had obviously damaged my airways because it was from then on I had to use oxygen when I ran. So that was trying to avoid infections is a good idea, but sometimes you just can't do it.
Yeah.
So I paid the price for that one. So yeah, as I said earlier, all my running these days are done with an oxygen backpack.
So do you now have PB with oxygen as opposed to PB without? So you've got two.
I do, and I had this wild dream that one day I could break my non-oxygen PB with oxygen, but I think that's a wild dream.
Yeah. Unless technology catches up and they find other ways of doing lighter portable oxygen concentrators.
Yeah, I think also that's what's that, 8 years ago. So I think age is a factor in that.
Yeah, okay. Uh, so what have other patients said about your story? Obviously, you have your website and your blog, so you must have quite a wide reach. So you must hear from a lot of other people.
I do. It's nearly a full-time job. When I first started my journey, a friend of mine said you should start up a blog and share your experience with people, and I just thought, okay, I'll do that. And I was doing it more for therapy for myself, to talk about my experiences, and anyhow, so that grew and grew and grew, and now I have quite a big following. And it's, if you hear of a patient who can run marathons with COPD, that's going to get the attention of people in that respiratory community. And so people will reach out to me and ask me for tips and all that sort of thing. And anything I say to them, I say, you have to clear this with your doctor, because I'm not a medical professional. I can tell you what I do, but that may not be the same for you. So I would honestly, there's not a week goes past I don't get a patient reaching out asking me things. I think one of the things that's highlighted for me, but is the lack of referrals to pulmonary rehab, and that's not just in Australia; that's globally. It's still a very underused resource. Patients are still being diagnosed, given their inhalers, and being told to go and make themselves comfortable, which is the worst thing they can do because they really need to go and make themselves uncomfortable, and that's through pulmonary rehab through exercise. But there's obvious benefits to that. But likewise, I get really inspired from the things I see patients doing. I've watched a woman for her 60th birthday push a pram with oxygen cylinders around to complete a half marathon. I mean, that's willpower for you. So it's really good to see people, having goals, whatever they are, and achieving them, and that's really motivating for me.
Yeah. Um, are you able to talk more about the actual work that you do? Because you've got you're involved with quite a few different things. Just wondering if you'd be able to talk a bit more about those.
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm doing myself and a respiratory professional from the UK. We run a little event called on World COPD Day. It's called the Big Baton Pass. And what it is, it's a 24-hour event that is run through 3 different time zones. So it's run Australia Pacific, and then through Europe and Africa, and the UK, and then also in the Americas. We have healthcare professionals come on and talk. We have pulmonary rehab groups. We have spirometry companies come and talk about spirometry. And the whole focus of the event is around activity. So we've had 2 years of this event. This year will be our 3rd year. And I think what's really good about it is last year, which was our 2nd year, we had audiences from over 40 countries. So we're getting a really wide reach. And the message we can get across with this event is all about rehab, pulmonary rehab, where to go, what to do, and give people resources, especially people who are in countries that don't have those resources or people who live remote. And so, they can't just rock up to a rehab class because one doesn't exist. So a lot of my focus these days is on building this event. We now have a working group that comprises of healthcare professionals in the UK, the US, and here in Australia. And we coordinate. Last year was about 68 sites we coordinated for the whole event. So this year, my focus is really about patient involvement, getting more patients involved. So it's something I've always wanted to do, and I actually found a healthcare professional with exactly the same mindset as me. She's a runner as well, so we sort of clicked from the start. So that's my main focus. I'm involved in a few studies at the moment where we're looking at technology and wearables, excuse me, that can predict exacerbations. And to me, that's a really interesting field. So as a patient, if you can have a wearable that's predicting an exacerbation, so you can start your medication early, you can be proactive. I think that's a really good way for a patient to be able to manage their disease more successfully. That space is one that's really interesting. The particular research we're doing involves an algorithm around AI. Um, watch this space. I think there's going to be some huge advances as far as patients being able to monitor stuff from home, being able to Bluetooth data straight to their doctors or sync straight to their doctors. That's really a very interesting space for me.
Yeah. And so finally, what are your top tips for patients and professionals?
For patients, be consistent. And that's the number one thing with everything you do, with taking your medication, with a healthy diet, and with exercise. Don't look at it as something you're going to do this week or next week. Do it every day. Because if you get those three things right, that will make a big difference to your quality of life. And it doesn't matter where you're starting from, how low your base is. If you're consistent in those things, it's going to make a difference. And, when we're talking activity, as I've said earlier, it's not about running marathons. It's about doing things that you can do. And if that's walking around the block, once a day or 3 times a week or 4 times a week, whatever it be, and then doing that week after week after week, it's that sort of consistency that's going to build the results, going to build your exercise capacity, and it's going to give you a better quality of life. For healthcare professionals, listen to patients. We are quite well versed in how our body's running. Refer your patients to pulmonary rehab. Help them out. Help connect them to those networks, because they're the things that are going to make a big difference in a patient's life. We're not going to get a silver bullet that's going to cure COPD. It's a structural disease. So apart from replacing your lungs, it's going to be there. So what we need to do is exercise those lungs. So as I say, I get 100% out of my lungs, even though I've only got 30-odd% capacity. I'll get 100% of that 35%.
Yeah. Well, Russell, thank you very much for your time talking me through all of that. Very inspirational. I can relate to so much of it. It was really great to talk to you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for the opportunity. Can I just remind people, World COPD Day, COPD Baton Pass is the website. Save the date, get involved. It's a really big initiative we're trying to push so we can improve the lives of patients.